Brexit is dragging down the economy and its impact is set to get worse due to new trade barriers, as the government's budget watchdog is warning in the UK. The UK's gross domestic product is set to grow by a modest 0.8% this year, before picking up to around 2% annually over the next 4 years, at least according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR. But in its detailed analysis of Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's budget, it stressed the effects of subdued investment, the energy price shock, and Brexit compound the ongoing weakness seen since the financial crisis. The OBR expects Britain's recovery, having fallen into recession at the end of last year, to largely be driven by a pickup in household consumption growth to around 2% from 25 to 28. Compared to last autumn, it now expects higher household disposable incomes, a sharper slowdown in inflation, and lower interest rates. But it believes Britain's net trade will make a negligible contribution to growth over coming years. We forecast that trade volumes will continue to be subdued in the next few years due to sluggish growth in the UK and global economies and the evolving impact of Brexit. From 24 to 28, we expect export and import volumes to average growth of 0.3% and 0.1% a year, respectively. The OBR also emphasized that the full implementation of the Brexit Trade and Cooperation Agreement signed on December 30th in 2020 between the European Union and the United Kingdom will further increase barriers to trade in goods with the EU in the coming months. The application of the TCA remains ongoing, so Brexit is not done, with the UK implementing physical inspections on imports from the EU from April 24 and further declaration requirements from October 24. We expect the total impact of Brexit to be realized several years after full implementation of these barriers. The government, though, is refusing to acknowledge there is economic damage from Brexit. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said, "The government is very clear of the benefits that the UK has already seen since leaving the European Union." I would really like to know what drugs they are taking, by the way. He highlighted a new independent trade policy had led to the signing of trade deals, the taking back control of the UK's borders, and revoking of more than 2,000 laws. Control of the borders. But the budget watchdog stuck to its prediction over the scale of economic damage being inflicted on Britain by Brexit, splintering it away from its biggest trading partner, the European Union, and the government has yet to strike a much-promised free trade deal with the USA or one with India, and tens of thousands of asylum seekers and economic migrants have crossed the channel by small boats in recent years. On the economics, the OBR explained, "Since the June 2016 EU referendum, our forecasts have assumed that the volume of UK imports and exports will both be 15% lower than if we had remained in the EU. We assume that the resulting reduction in the trade intensity of GDP will lead to a 4% reduction in the potential productivity of the UK economy relative to remaining in the EU, with a full effect felt after 15 years. Going into further detail, the OBR stressed that trade volumes in all advanced economies declined sharply at the height of the COVID pandemic in 2020. However, UK trade intensity, that means exports plus imports as a share of GDP, has not recovered in line with other G7 countries since then. In the third quarter of 23, UK trade intensity remained 1.7% below its pre-pandemic level from 2019. By contrast, it had risen 1.7% above pre-pandemic levels on average in the rest of the G7. And they also emphasized that growth in UK goods trade has fallen well behind the rest of the G7. At the end of 23, UK goods trade was around 10% below 2019 levels, while it was around 5% higher on average for the rest of the G7 in the third quarter. Meanwhile, UK services trade growth has been strongest in the G7. It reached around 12% above 2019 levels at the end of 23 versus around 9% above in the rest of the G7 in the third quarter. Explaining these different trends, the OBR highlighted 4 possible factors. Global trade and services, where the UK has a relative comparative advantage, has grown faster than global goods trade since 2008, and post-Brexit trade barriers have created more significant frictions for goods than services. The UK is less dependent on the EU for service exports than goods exports. And digitalization makes trade and some services easier and less dependent on physical proximity. UK services trade has continued to grow strongly, including with the EU, despite the increase in trade barriers post-Brexit, as the OBR said. Around 2/3 of this growth since 2019 was driven by the other business services sector, which includes management consulting, research and development, and advertising, while exports of financial services and transport declined 5.9% and 2% respectively. Brexit continues to come undone slowly, piece by piece, as the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union fails to stick. A return to the Union is not imminent, but is becoming at least more wanted. And I don't think it's easier to pull off, but that might change. And thousands of analogies about Brexit have been penned in the nearly 8 years since the UK voters narrowly decided to quit the EU. From a clown car suddenly falling apart at the seams to a sinking ship rapidly taken on water, writers have exhausted the well of metaphor and satire here. But most of that descriptive language normally framed Brexit struggles as a quick collapse. Actually, this is more like a retreating glacier, inevitably climbing its way back up the mountain as it is slowly warmed up by unpleasant realities. The UK government's attempts to unpick EU law and forge its own path have regularly come up against a brick wall, for example. And if it wasn't the tenets of the Northern Ireland Protocol holding Westminster back, then it was simple truths about commerce and trade, preventing wholesale changes to how business is done. Recent attempts to reform engine standards and product labeling have come to naught because lawmakers have realized that sticking with the current regime of rules and regulations is by far the easiest course of action. And more of these nitty-gritty details are set to rear their head soon. The EU is implementing a new carbon border tax called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. It will impose tariffs on certain imported goods that don't meet the EU's sustainability criteria. Indian steel, Turkish aluminum, Chinese cement. If these goods are manufactured using dirty processes and the emissions are not charged at home, the EU will do it for them and keep the profits. The UK obviously fits into this, and although it has its own version of the EU's carbon market, it might not be able to withstand the impact of CBAM, especially when it comes to the lucrative trade in electricity. If the UK cannot export its renewable energy, which it intends to keep rolling out at a fast pace, then the business case collapses. Then the EU will have less green power to tap into, increasing emissions, meaning everyone loses. Consider Chinese electric cars as well. Brussels is on the cusp of slapping tariffs on Chinese EVs from firms that have been granted subsidies and tax breaks that breached the EU's competition rules. If the Union does indeed end up taking the step, temporary measures might be imposed as early as July, then that creates a headache for the UK, whose import tariffs are already lower than the EU as it is. Westminster would likely have to follow suit and implement the same or a similar regime in order to prevent China from flooding its markets with EVs that were destined for the mainland Europe market. It is just another example of many where alignment and being inside the club rather than peering through the window is advantageous. The case for remaining outside gets weaker and flimsier with each passing geopolitical event. Former EU Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier reiterated what he has been saying for the last 8 years during a meeting of his political group last week that the door is still open for the UK to return. Well, I beg to differ with Michel there, but that's a different point. That assessment is unlikely to change, and the case for it from the EU side will arguably only get stronger in the coming years. Russia's threat on the EU's eastern flank will not be resolved anytime soon, and Donald Trump might become US president again in November. The EU needs friends, and the UK, a nuclear power, fits the bill nicely. From an internal politics point of view, the EU has seen France's hand on the tiller increase its grip since the UK left and Germany lost Angela Merkel as Chancellor. A returning UK would likely go some way to readdressing that balance of power, but at a high cost. Behind the scenes turned to a couple of diplomats to ask what they thought of the idea and how it would work with other countries trying to join the EU, in particular Ukraine. And the general consensus was that there is no queue, and that if the UK were to meet the technical criteria, then the political hurdles would not be impossible to overcome. Who knows if that means joining the euro or Schengen? Yes, I would say it would. Nothing will change until the current Conservative government's 14 years in charge come to an end. That is almost certainly going to happen later this year at a general election that Labour is expected to win in a landslide. Brexit's 10-year anniversary will be celebrated during this new government's first 2 years in charge. Whether that will be enough to start reversing it remains to be seen, but momentum is building in its favour. But I am less optimistic than some diplomats in Brussels about the chances of the UK for joining the EU. And if you want to know some more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.